I feel as though I'm in front of the United Nations, though it's a mini United Nations, but virtually every kind of country is represented here. And it's a real privilege to speak to you on your first night in Kochi. I have heard a lot about this center, but this is the first time that I'm here, but I'm familiar with the work of the center and also the dramatis personae, the people involved in this institution. And it is good to see that their activities go beyond Kerala, beyond India, and have reached the shores of many countries, and they have been able to attract you here. Because I was coming here, I thought mine would be an after-dinner speech, because that is one of the most difficult things to do. I'm sure you must have heard the story of a gladiator, you know, the Roman gladiator. He was thrown in front of a hungry lion. And the gladiator, everybody was watching, thousands of people were watching to see that the gladiator would now eat up, the lion would now eat up the gladiator. But what he did was he went and said something in the ears of the lion, and immediately the lion went back into the cage. So everybody was quite astonished. And so they all went up to him and asked, "What did you do? What did you say to the lion?" He said, "I told him, you can eat me up, there is no problem, but after that you will have to make an after-dinner speech." And so the lion decided it's better not to make a speech rather than eat and then having to make an after-dinner speech. It's supposed to be the most difficult thing on earth. So I'm glad that it's before dinner, so you will be just hungry and not angry as I go on. Well, I do not know really what issues I should touch upon in this inaugural session. You're all researchers, you live in different parts of the world, and you may have some idea about India, its position in the world, and what we are aspiring to do. So I thought if you are going to research on issues relating to India, maybe I should give a little introduction on India, in the sense that what are the present concerns of India? I'm not going into history. But if you are living in India today, what is it that engages the attention of the Indian people today? What are the issues that we are preoccupied with? I'll just touch upon 3 or 4, not all the issues that we are preoccupied with. But if you watch television or start reading Indian newspapers from tomorrow, you will hear about all these points that I'd like to make. So when you read it, you will be able to catch upon the kind of developments that we see every day around you. You are here only for 18 days, I understand. But 18 days are enough to get a flavor of what India is, what India aspires to be. And I also presume that many of you have read about India, a little bit of India's history, a little bit of India's politics, our public policy, and our international posture. So, but if you read the newspaper tomorrow, I think the most important issue that you will see in it is the situation on the India-Pakistan border. I realize that we have someone from Pakistan here, so I'll speak with great restraint and responsibility. But I think we are facing a first-class crisis in our relations with Pakistan at this point in time. I'm sure you know the history of India-Pakistan relations, at least to some extent. But the point, remember, is that we are the same people, people of India and people of Pakistan. By a sheer problem of history, or shall we say, a peculiar historic situation, India was divided into India and Pakistan. And at that time, the intention was that the Muslims of the subcontinent will live in Pakistan and the Hindus of the subcontinent will live in India. But as it has happened today, we have more than 100 million Muslims in India, in fact, larger than the population of Pakistan. So the whole concept that this was on the basis of religion that this division was made has already been proved wrong. But We have a number of issues which were left behind after partition. I'm not going to the long history because it will take me several days to explain all that to you. But the issue is basically that we have certain disputes between us which have held back the progress of both India and Pakistan. Internationally, we have been seen as rivals or even enemies. And this has complicated the situation for India and Pakistan on the subcontinent. But both the countries, I think, have been trying, after several wars have been fought, after having become nuclear weapon powers that both of us are today. And that is why you all have a stake in India-Pakistan peace, because if we start a nuclear war, we are not the only ones who will be completely destroyed, but also the rest of the world. And that is why the world is looking at us anxiously. So we are very much on a path of reconciliation, on a path towards normalization of relations with Pakistan. But there are several actors in this whole political scenario between India and Pakistan. Not only the state actors, but also non-state actors. As a result, efforts at normalization, however responsible and however sincere they have been, have not moved very fast between our two countries. But we have managed to maintain peace between the two countries since 1971. The last time we had a war was in 1971. After that, we had the Simla Agreement of 1972. And since then, a process of reconciliation has been taking place. But there is an issue because there are divided families in both India and Pakistan. We have not been able to trade between us on the border. So a number of issues. So what we were moving towards was, we were moving towards a situation where the border becomes transparent, the border becomes irrelevant in a sense, because people should be able to move back and forth, but land will remain as it is. That was the solution that we were working on. They all would like to be friendly with both the countries. So even when we fight among ourselves in the United Nations, speaking against each other, which we normally do, the others don't say anything. They will quietly come and tell us, you have done very well, keep it up, to us and also to Pakistan. And that is what most countries do. In fact, there is a joke about a Jordanian ambassador in the UN. What happened was they always want to balance India and Pakistan all the time. So one day he decided to appeal to both the countries to be peaceful and not to fight, etc. So the Jordanian ambassador started by saying, I appeal to my brother Jordan, brother Pakistan, he said, because Muslim countries refer to each other as brothers. No? So quite unknowingly he said that, because he should not have said that. But he said, I appeal to my brother Pakistan. And then he suddenly realized, how would he balance it? So immediately said, and my sister India, he said. So that is the kind of level of balance that the world tries to do. The other issue that you'll hear is, of course, basically an internal issue. I won't go into greater detail. Two issues are of great concern to India today internally. One is this case of a gang rape of a 23-year-old girl in Delhi. It has aroused the conscience of India greater than any other brutal attack that has taken place. Because this is not the only attack. In fact, even that, after that incident, a few incidents have taken place in India. But for some reason, this particular incident of the brutal murder of a young lady has roused the conscience of India to such an extent that the government cannot afford not to change the law with regarding to rape in India. Of course, it has not been very stringent. The punishment was only 7 years or something. And the responsibility was always for the victim to prove the guilt of the guilty. And so you will find a number of writings, legal and otherwise in India, which relates to this particular incident. And I think this is going to transform Indian law forever. How far it will go, we do not know, but certainly there's a movement here. And the social networking, the Facebook and Twitter have played a very big role. I think this is for the first time for social change in India, social networking has been effective. Of course, you know what happened in the Arab world, and wherever you have revolutions, always the social network has played a role. Because in a democratic country, it cannot be as effective as in an authoritarian country. You know why? Because the argument can always be, you have the next elections. You can vote against the government. So the government will not change because of social networking. It may happen in Tunisia, it may happen in Egypt, it may happen in Libya, but it will not happen in India. Because we are a democratic country and the leaders are elected by us. So the argument is, you go to parliament. You don't force the government to resign. You need to take legal action and legislative action in parliament in order to solve the issue. So that is the path we are taking. And the other internal issue of which great concern that you might come across is this whole story of corruption. Corruption, of course, is not new or special to India. I have been to many countries where corruption is in fact slightly worse than here. I was in Kenya, for example. And there's a funny story about what happened in Kenya. Once a report came on, the most corrupt countries in the world. And Kenya was second or third there. So there was a big uproar in parliament, in the Kenyan parliament. You must do something about this. How can this be? Kenya, the worst, or at least most seriously corrupt country. So the president said, I promise you, next time we'll do something. And next time the report came, Kenya was not mentioned there. There was no Kenya in the report. You know what the president did? They went and bribed the people who write the reports. And so they said Kenya and an asterisk and said, statistics not available this year. So that is the height of the... And there is another funny story about a Kenyan minister who went to Italy. And the Italian minister invited our Kenyan friend to his apartment. And the Kenyan minister was very impressed. What a fabulous apartment. Luxurious, everything beautiful, etc. So he took him aside and asked the Italian minister, how did you make so much money? I am also a minister, I don't have any money. The Italian minister said, come with me. So he took him to the nearest window and said, look, can you see that huge bridge there? So Kenyan minister said, yes. I took 10% of that, he said. And then he showed him a huge apartment building and he said, I took 10% of that, he said. So our Kenyan minister was fully educated. He went back. 5 years later, he invited the Italian minister to come to Kenya. And when he went there, the Kenyan minister had even a much bigger and much nicer apartment, maybe a nice house. So the Italian minister asked him, you did the same thing, right? He said, yes. He took him to the window and said, do you see that huge bridge there? So the Italian minister looked and said, I don't see any bridge. Why? I don't see anything. He said, I took 100%, he said. But we don't take 100%. In India, we take only a few percent. But if India is held back in our economic development today, if people are not making the kind of sacrifices that they ought to make, it is because of corruption. Because it's not that somebody else is making money and you are jealous of them. No. No individual will be wanting to make sacrifices for the future if that sacrifice, the benefit of that sacrifice, does not go to their children. So if I have to make a sacrifice for my country, if I have to be honest and if I have to do my work, then I should not be seeing around me people not doing their work and making a lot of money and, looking after themselves. So I myself start thinking, why should I make a sacrifice for this country? Because it is not going to benefit my children. And this is really the psychology that is working in India. So everybody, almost anybody, in one way or the other is corrupt because they do not think that it is wrong. They think that is a done thing. If somebody asks you for speeding up an application, if somebody asks you for a few rupees, he does not feel bad. First, he feels that he is underpaid anyway. If a police constable who is paid miserably, and if he gets a chance to catch you without a driving license, he'll say, well, I can fine you 2,000 rupees officially, but if you give me 1,000 rupees, I'll let you go. So this is the kind of situation developing here. But this is not the kind of small corruption which has come to light in the last few years, 2 or 3 years. Millions of dollars gone into private pockets. So India today is absolutely rocked by the kind of scams engaged by senior people, ministers, senior civil servants. I don't know how many of them are in jail today, but many of them still deserve to be in jail, I think. And that is the other issue that you will hear about. And going back to the international situation, we have a great concern about China. This probably is something which you are familiar with. The problem is not just the rise of China. The China is rising, everybody knows. Everybody knows also that China is now trying to dominate the world. And the only country that they think is their rival in this is the United States. They do not think India is a rival to China. So they have already overtaken India, and they are very keen that they must establish sovereign domination in the world in the next 20 years or so. And there are signs. Everybody concedes that the power of the world is shifting from the west to the east because of the diminishing importance of the United States, the diminishing importance of Europe. And this is something recognized all over the world. And so China's rise is something which is real. It is not imaginary. And it is quite possible that China to be the most important economic power in the next 20 or 30 years. Not that the United States will decline to such an extent that China will be the only superpower. No. So we are looking at the world with several countries as a multipolar world. You will have United States, you will have Russia, you will have European Union, you will have Japan, and you will have India and China. At the same time, both of us are developing countries. Both of us are huge developing countries with similar problems in trade, on environment, on human rights. And many of these issues, India and China see eye to eye as against the West. We have similar points of view on trade, points of view on environment, points of view on human rights, etc. So on the one hand, we have very many areas of cooperation with China. Our trade with China is now $80 billion. Of course, out of 80, 70 billion is one way. We only buy from them. They don't buy anything from us. But still, it is a fruitful relationship. Of course, our relations with the United States has improved tremendously in the last few years. After the Cold War, during the Cold War, of course, the United States used to consider us as a satellite of the Soviet Union, which we were not. But because of historical factors, there are issues on which India and the Soviet Union worked together. You know, part of India's economic development, Soviet Union was responsible. Our basic industries like steel, heavy machinery, etc. were all supported by the Soviet Union because the United States refused to cooperate with us at that time. So we had good relations with the Soviet Union, but of course that was historical fact. And after the end of the Cold War, this is no more a factor. And our relationship with the United States has been improving gradually. And the only issue that remained unresolved when I left the United States in 2000 was the nuclear issue. I felt that this issue will never be resolved because we do not sign the NPT, and unless you sign the NPT, United States will not recognize India's nuclear capability. It was a tough issue. But President Bush had the courage, which no other American president had, to deal with that issue. And the nuclear deal of 2008, you may have heard, resolved that issue without India signing the NPT. Without signing the NPT, India is considered, not in legally, but in official terms, in India's nuclear weapon capability was recognized by the United States. And since then, there are no issues between India and the US. Because there are always problems which can be resolved. And we have been getting closer and closer together. We have joint exercises in the Indian Ocean. We have 52 groups working on India-US cooperation, starting from terrorism down to weights and measures. So every issue, education, for example. So India-US relations are improving a lot, and that is one of the arguments that China is making, that when you have friends next door to your border, why are you going around looking for friends abroad? But your neighbor, if he is not very friendly, you may have to look for friends abroad. And this is not directed against China, certainly. And the other thing that India is doing, this is my last point, regarding alignments with like-minded countries. India used to be proud of its non-aligned status. So non-alignment in that context meant that we will not be aligned to either of the power blocks. Basically, the principle was that we will act independently. Independence of action, independence of thought. That was India's policy. So whether there are two blocks or there is only one block, we still are non-aligned. And that's why we say that non-alignment is still valid. Because non-alignment does not simply mean that you are not aligned with A or B. It means that we will always take action on the basis of our own best judgment. And that is what we are doing even today. Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet bloc collapsed, but even when the United States is the most powerful country in the world, we remain non-aligned with them in the sense that we take our decisions ourselves. Now we are moved forward. Now there are kind of, what shall we say, selective alignment with countries. It's not ideological alignments, but selective alignments with countries which think alike. Like you have heard about BRICS, that is Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa. What is common among all these countries? These are all developing countries, big countries with fast pace of growth. We have the ASEAN, with which we have very close relationship. We have IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa working together. When it comes to environment, we have a group, ABC, in which China itself is involved. So, rather than being non-aligned all the time and not being associated with anybody in any way, India is moving towards what we call selective alignments for specific purposes, for practical reasons. So with Russia and China, we work in one group. With the United States, we work in another group. We work with ASEAN in another group. But none of it is a military bloc. None of it is an ideological configuration. It is a matter of identifying countries with equal ideas and then work towards this. And that leads me to the final point about the reform of the United Nations. And this is something which India attaches great importance. Because the United Nations today does not reflect the power position of the world today. It reflects the position of the world of 1945. So this has to change. What are these 5 permanent members doing there without representation from developing countries, without any representation from Africa, without any representation from Latin America? From Asia, of course, there is China, but Japan is not there, India is not there. So the time has come for us to reform the UN, and that is where we are working with Brazil, Germany, Japan, what is called the G4 in the United Nations. So that's another group in which we are working together with like-minded countries. So today, India is on the verge of developing its international relations in a way which is beneficial, non-ideological, non-military. But at the same time, we are aware of these problems, we are conscious of these problems, and we try to tackle them in as many ways as possible with like-minded nations. So India looks forward to being one of the 6 poles of the world, as I said. So it will not be just a single country or 2 countries which will determine the future of the world, but that can be realized like G8 became G20. Similarly, the Security Council of the United Nations must also be expanded so that the reality of world power should be reflected in it. So these are some of the concerns that India has. These are the kind of issues that you will hear if you live here for some time. And I'm sure these are the kind of issues that you must research on. And with that, I have the great pleasure to declare your winter course inaugurated.